I'm Bobby Peer with Tap Into, and I'm here with David Blowbaum and Eva Aday with Summit Prep. We're going to continue the conversation regarding the SATs and ACTs. Eva, can you continue the conversation?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I know last week we started talking about some of the reasons why people are so against the SAT and ACT, and actually why I think that's misguided. But the first one we tackled was the content. Remember, the notion that the content are ethnically or racially biased because of the words on the actual verbal section of the SAT, and we went into the stats of it, and we figured out that that's actually factually not true. Statistically, we came out to say, to demonstrate that the tests actually go through a lot of rigor. So the content is objectively as most of us know it to be. It's just as objective as any other assessment, like an MCAT or an LSAT and things like that. So.
And so where do we go from here? I mean, another controversy that we talked about is possibly the social economic relevancy of the ACT and SAT and being prepared for it.
Yeah, I think that to me, what happened was because of that, what was supposed to be a bombshell in 2003, that initial argument about like the race part of it, because of that, there's been a cacophony of arguments. So many of them, I mean, some valid, some not so valid, about questions about the test. And you're right. I think some of the big arguments are that it only correlates and strongly correlates with socioeconomic status. And that means it only benefits the haves, if you will. Other arguments has been that it doesn't help us figure out how students are going to do once they are in schools, and the biggest predictor of college performance, et cetera. I mean, there's a way to kind of rebut those very quickly, and then we can go to what I really believe is actually the issue at hand. In terms of the social economic status part, yes, generally speaking, if you have more money or you earn more, you come from a household, or a student comes from a household that has higher earnings, they generally on average tend to do better. I think, I'll shoot this over to David to talk about the nuances of the stats of that, but that is not the case for every single student. In fact, we have found that, this was like a 2005 study, and there's nothing that has rebutted this since. It found that African-American students who come from a household where the earnings is anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000 do 61 points worse than their white counterpart students whose families earn $10,000 or less.
Wow.
Can you imagine? So is it really just the economics of things? And I don't want to take this away from David, but he has this incredible stat that talks about how the variance in scores, it's really not, only 4% of that is related to how much money your parents have, and 96% of it is not. And David, you can go ahead and kind of explain that a little bit more if you want, to basically add to the fact that it's not as they are presenting it to be.
Yeah, I mean, so even that is the stat. So, when you do regression analyses, only 4% of SAT scores are explainable solely by a parent's socioeconomic status. So other things come into play. So do wealthier families, do their kids on average have higher test scores? Yeah, but they're going to better schools and they're getting tutoring. And, tutoring might get a bad name, but let's think of it like this. So if you work really, really hard at tennis, you're going to get better at tennis, right? Now, if you have a really, really good coach who, you might pay a lot of money to, you're probably going to get even better at tennis. But that doesn't mean you didn't need to work hard to get really good at tennis. So does the tutoring help students on the SAT and ACT? If you're going to a really good tutor, yeah, it probably does. I wouldn't necessarily say that means there's any flaw in the test personally, because in order to get really good at tennis, you have to get good at tennis. In order to get good at the SAT and ACT, you have to get good at grammar. You have to get good at math. You have to get good at reading. All of those things that are preparing you for college and that help to predict your success in college. So it's not just an empty metric. It really is, by preparing students for the SAT and ACT, we're actually preparing them to succeed in college as well. I mean, when we read over students' essays, students who haven't gotten much prep, they're making mistakes with pronoun agreement, with subject-verb agreement, with dangling modifiers. Those are the same topics tested on the ACT and SAT. And when we do prep with them and teach them that grammar, they're not making those mistakes on those college essays. They're then not making those mistakes in college. And actually the English section of the ACT, for instance, of the 4 sections, it's the most predictive of your success in college.
Oh, wow.
Because being a good reader, being a good writer, knowing grammar, that, especially being a good writer, I mean, there's so many professions and majors that you need to be able to write well, and it's really a good measure of, do you know rhetorical skills and do you know grammar well? So yes, do scores correlate with socioeconomic status? They do, because socioeconomic status correlates with having been better prepared and having more advantages in life generally. But the SAT and ACT are not measuring just wealth, because clearly there's a lot of kids that come from wealthy families who are doing really poorly on the exams. Why? Because they don't know the knowledge for it. So it's not something you can't pay someone $10,000 and then all of a sudden you're good at tennis. No, you had to put in the hard work for it. So in the same way, you can't pay for a higher score. If you're going to get a higher score, you need to put in the work to actually learn the content.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would argue too, and actually I think part of this whole thing that we're talking about is, yes, not everyone has the means to hire a coach. Mm-hmm. I spoke with another colleague in the industry, and he said that life has changed exponentially in the last 15 years. We have so many more resources, and students have so many more resources to study for these exams than they did 15 years ago, and to actually study and do very well.
Yeah.
So, I think most parents would, listening would be like, okay, sure, great. But what if I don't actually have the money for a good tennis coach? Where are they supposed to be getting those pointers? Where are they supposed to learn their backhand or their forehand or whatever sport you want to use as the example in school? Right. So they're supposed to go ahead and, everyone pays taxes. We do what we're supposed to do, because this is the system that is supposed to make them as competitive as possible and teach them. Look, I always say to my students, not everything can be taught. Not everything can be taught. So yeah, sure, maybe someone will have a great coach or a great this. But even the basics of having the right education is what's missing. So that's what's actually happening. I think for me, before furthering our conversation, it's really important that people delineate between the test as it sits on either electronically or on a piece of paper doesn't have agency. That test in and of itself is not, quote unquote, hurting you. The outcome of the test and the subsequent results and what that means, yes, has a huge impact on people's lives. But the content itself, as we know, is not biased. The test you take itself doesn't hurt you or help you in any way. It is all of these things that we have set up socially in terms of education, closure mechanisms, and the outcome of how you do is what impacts people. So let's separate, I think, a lot of things from the actual test itself. And then let's talk about, gee, if that's the case, why do we have this gap? What is happening?
How do we improve this?
Yeah, how do we improve this? Because you're absolutely right in terms of what David said. You will have parents who will have the resources to get their kids tennis practice if everyone's supposed to learn tennis at school. But the gap is so wide, even when you measure it in terms of school. And the whole conversation started with the socioeconomic part of it. And I was pointing that out to say, gee, it's not just the money. There's something more to it. Right. So if it's not the content, if it's not the money, and then, one of the last big arguments is that it's not the best predictor of how you're going to do in college. I'm going to take a different approach to that to say, it is supposed to be a measure of your preparedness, meaning how much have you learned through your tenure in school up to going to school? That's number one, what it's supposed to be. Does it correlate? It helps with correlating how students do and perform on the exam. And there are a lot of in-school and out-of-school factors that I think help make that true. But that whole argument about, gee, it doesn't predict how you're going to do in school. A lot of things don't predict how you're going to do in school.
And it levels the playing.
Yeah,
field,
I mean,
right?
that's part of life, right? But what it is supposed to do, I think it does well, which is, do you know your formulas for certain things? David just talked about rhetorical analysis and being strong with those. Are you able to write argumentative essays? All of these other things, those are the things it's supposed to test you on, and I think it does that. So these three big arguments that people have aren't really arguments. And for me, it is, I want to validate a lot of the outrage, the sadness, and the anger that people do feel from seeing the disparity in numbers. That's number one. And also the outcome of said disparity, right? So because there is a gap between students perceived to be white and minority students, and more sharply between, Black, white students, if you will, that leads to them not being able to go to certain schools and all these other outcomes. And even if they do, there's so much more that we're going to talk about. But what's happening? Why is this happening? I would argue it's happening because almost, is it 67 years after Brown versus Board of Ed? We are still very much separate and very much unequal. This country's educational system is grossly unequal and extremely segregated. So therein lies the problem. African-American students, and I'm using mostly African-American students, but we can talk about minority students as well, but we see the biggest variance between African-American students and students perceived to be white are not getting enough education. The quality is subpar. They don't have the same resources. And there are so many out of school as well as in school factors that is causing for the gap, not just to be great, but it has increased.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. And I hope that my readers are seeing where the ACT and SAT fit in the admission process.
Yeah, I think, so what should we walk away from? So the first thing we talked about was, we are going to go down this path of figuring out what are the big arguments against the SATs and ACTs, or standardized exams. Let's see if it's valid. We know statistically that's not the case. We know that economically there is always going to be a correlation with social economic status in people generally improving and doing better, but that doesn't account for a large amount of the variance. Mm-hmm. And we also know that the tests do what they're supposed to do, which is to test your kids on what they've learned before they go to school. What we have now come to is to say that the gap that's happening is because our country currently has an educational system that is unfair and unequal. And, I'll talk about, it's so funny how the ruling says that, separate is unequal, but how later on this whole segregation and separating, how we're still very much segregated, impacts finances, impacts schooling, impacts African-American students, going to school in high poverty areas. 72.4% of them go to school in predominantly African-American schools, mostly Black schools that are in high poverty areas. That should give you an idea of what we're working with right now. So hopefully we can then have a more meaningful and honest conversation about what's happening. How do we change it? But yeah.
I look forward to that. So we'll reconvene next week And
Yeah.
thank you for this enlightenment.
Of course. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah.